Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It is Friday, March 29th. Last week's terrorist attack on a major concert venue in Moscow left well over 140 people dead and many more wounded. Russian authorities were quick to blame Ukraine and the West. But the men captured and accused of having conducted the attack were Tajiks and obviously affiliated with an offshoot of the Islamic State, which claimed responsibility for the attacks moments after it happened. So what does this attack, which came with a CIA warning, tell us about the state of security in Russia today? Then we take a look at the terrorist threat more generally. In the wake of growing competition between the West and China, the war in Ukraine, and the growing conflict in the Middle East, the threat of terrorism that dominated our thinking for so many years earlier this century seemed to have disappeared from our consciousness. Was that a mistake? And are we now seeing a revival of terrorism concentrated in the very same places that it was before the 9/11 attacks? Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran coming back. And finally, Gaza. On Monday, the United States, for the first time since October 7, abstained in a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire and the release of hostages. Israel's reaction was furious, and Benjamin Netanyahu canceled a visit of top aides to Washington to discuss the next phase of the war. So is this the time that Israel and the United States have finally broken over Gaza, or are we seeing a lot of political shadow boxing? So here to talk about these issues are three reporters who cover these stories. Catherine Philp is World Affairs Editor at the Times of London. Philip Stevens is Contributing Editor of the Financial Times. And Matt Kaminski is Editor-at-Large at Politico. Good morning, all. Good afternoon for those in London. Wonderful to see all of you. Catherine, let's start with you. And sort of very strange, an attack claimed by ISIS-K, conducted by Tajiks, clearly warned by the United States that it was coming from ISIS-K, and yet Moscow authorities are reacting. It's all a Western/Ukrainian plot. Tell us a little bit about what happened and why this reaction, and what does it tell us about the state of security services and the state of security inside Russia?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, Moscow is perhaps the attack that we should all have seen coming, but didn't, except, of course, the CIA did and warned Russia. What Russia did with that information will be very interesting to disentangle in the future if we find out whether it was taken seriously, but that what we're hearing now from Moscow is simply a message for public consumption. But I think what it tells you is that that really the whole world, in a sense, has turned away, almost terrorism fatigue after sort of 20 years of the war on terror, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. We've moved on to great power competition. We're concerned with China. We're concerned with Russia, and it's perhaps, in retrospect, quite predictable that someone like ISIS would take advantage of events like the war in Ukraine and indeed what's going on between Israel and Gaza, because both those conflicts are draining both Russia and America, who are, of course, enemies of ISIS. Now, ISIS don't seem to subscribe to the enemy of my friend at all. They like to see both Russia and America on a downward spiral. I think this is perhaps more predictable if you recall that Iran was attacked by ISIS-K, this Afghanistan-based offshoot of ISIS, or offshoot, because they came after the Syrian founding organization. So there was that attack in Iran in January, which again Iran tried to dissemble over and say that was Israel. So everyone's always trying to point at their primary enemy, and that is what Moscow did when they were attacked. If you look back, I mean, this is the deadliest Islamist attack in Russia for two decades, and of course, it was those conflicts, those attacks, and the wars in Chechnya and Dagestan that really propelled Putin to prominence, and got him his own kind of Mr. Security label in Russia. So those conflicts served him very well at that time, the Islamist threat. But when that threat receded, sort of post 2010, Putin's attention moved towards Eastern Europe, towards Georgia, to Ukraine, and now that's all he can see. And I mean, I think that's really part of the reason that Moscow has taken its eye off the ball where the Islamist threat is concerned. The FBS did not see this coming. They don't seem to have trusted the American warning. And I think we can conclude that really they're too busy looking for threats elsewhere, not just the supposed threat from Ukraine, but indeed the internal threat. So that they've actually become an agency far more concerned with, silencing internal dissent and cracking down on, in dissidents in Russia than actually looking out for, terrorist attacks from abroad. In a sense, they're more like a Praetorian Guard now for Putin than a domestic security service. So, I mean, this is a tough one for Putin because obviously it does undermine his strongman image, and it is very important. Clearly, the Russians see it as very important to try and turn this, like everything else, on Ukraine, rather than admit that they took their eye off another ball and ignored a separate threat. This, I think, will help them double down in their own minds and that of the public with the conflict that they've already undertaken. But it doesn't take away the fact that they are even more open, perhaps, than they have been for a long time to this kind of threat. Now, the fact these were Tajiks is interesting. Obviously, Tajikistan borders Afghanistan, where we believe these men were trained. Tajiks are able to travel in and out of Russia visa-free. So I think that the consequences for citizens of several Central Asian countries who are able to, Muslim countries, who are able to go in and out of Russia, let's see what happens there. They may find themselves, essentially the victims of a crackdown over this, yet to be seen. But one of the other reasons that I think Russia should be mindful of this threat is, of course, in the eyes of ISIS, which is a Sunni militant group, Russia is now part of this Shia Islamic force in the world that is still jostling for supremacy with the Sunnis. And we see that in the fact that obviously Russia is in an alliance with Iran that has proved useful to it in getting armaments for the war in Ukraine. But also Russia's support for the Assad regime in Syria, where I think it first brought Russia into very close contact with ISIS and its progenitor in Syria. So I would not rest easy if I were in the FSB or in the Kremlin right now. I think they've got a lot of catching up to do.
Philip, I think Catherine paints a really fulsome picture of what is Russia's confronting, and in some ways the surprise is that they were surprised, not just because the CIA warned them, and I've heard that in fact that warning included the actual location of the attack, and there were early indications that Russian security service had boosted their presence in the concert venue, at least at the beginning, perhaps not for the whole 3 or 4 weeks since the warning early in the month. But this idea, there is a fundamental conflict between ISIS and Russia that came out of the 2015 intervention in Syria, and now the strong alliance with Iran. And yet they seem to have been more concerned with Jehovah's Witnesses and LGBTQ extremists, which were declared an extremist organization just a few days before the attacks, than a real threat that's there and easily penetrating its country, given the reliance of the Russian economy on Tajik workers.
Yeah, I think that's right, but I think Catherine caught it as well, talking about Ukraine, in that, for Putin this year was about two things. Was one, his re-election, which of course he, was another triumph, whatever it was, 88% or whatever. But he had a fairly difficult year last year, both in Ukraine and also the threat to his own authority. This year is about entrenching Putin's power and winning in Ukraine. And you get the impression that Russia has, or the Russian regime has focused on nothing else but that. In Ukraine, they see a real opportunity, partly because of, the US is no longer supplying weapons on the scale that it was before, and that the hope that Trump will get in. Ukraine has its own problems we were talking earlier about, with morale and numbers of troops, but also its supplies of artillery, etc. So I think, you've had this sort of one-track approach in Russia. Now, that's obviously going to change. But for Putin, if you think about whatever the sort of medium to long-term threat, this is an absolutely critical year. He's got to show, or hopes to show, a significant progress in the summer fighting season, as it's called in Ukraine. He's hoping for Trump to get in, but he's got to hedge against the possibility, more than possibility, perhaps, that Biden will win. So I think the focus will remain for this year on Ukraine, but obviously, as you said, they're going to have to deploy some resources, and we will see, I think, a crackdown, as Catherine suggested, on people coming in from some of these Central Asian states, and there'll be a lot more surveillance and supervision.
Matt, how do you see it, and also sort of how do you interpret what the Russians are doing? Anything you want to add to that, and what they didn't do, frankly, but also be interested what was the reaction in Washington to this? Because frankly, if people have taken off their ball, the eye off the ball of Islamic terrorism, that's not just Russia. It's also true for much of the Washington debate, or indeed to the foreign policy community in the United States.
Right, but I would caution against talking about Russia like a normal country. And, there's only so much that you can kind of, even sort of discussing Russia as they are kind of in the same fight that we are against ISIS. I think there's just obvious differences. One, this is the probably worst police state in the world right now, bar North Korea. It is a kind of ruled by a single man with a single focus that Philip just described very well. There's also a unique history to Islamist terrorism in Russia itself. It is as much domestic Islamic terrorism as it is global jihad. And yes, Uzbeks and Chechens have been kind of affiliated with sort of the sort of global terrorist sort of Islamic movements over the last, since 9/11, or even before 9/11. These guys were Tajiks. They were from the former Soviet Union. They speak Russian. They kind of blended in as much as you can in sort of Moscow. And the grievances, yes, presumably tied to Syria and to the past, but also tied to very much to Russia's behavior in the Caucasus, going back to 1994 and the first invasion of Chechnya under Yeltsin, followed up by Yeltsin. The second thing is, we don't really know what the hell has happened and is actually going on. We don't know if these four people are the ones. Presumably they are. They could as easily be four people they rounded up who look Central Asian, and they beat him up pretty badly, cut one guy's ear off and put him on television. I'm not sort of, I don't want to spin conspiracy theories, because that's up to the Russians to do themselves. But when you are dealing with a country as opaque as Russia, there are only, that's as good an explanation as anything else. I think the one thing we know for sure is that, as with Beslan, with the attack on the school in 2004, which was the last terrible terrorist attack, which killed over 300 people in Russia, that was really the pretext that Putin used to make some very big steps toward authoritarianism. That's when he kind of got rid of elections for regional governors in 2004. It's not as if he needs any excuses now to repress even further, but it will be used as an excuse to repress certainly the kind of the Central Asian minority in Moscow itself. And actually, I think people sort of say, oh, this could have potentially weakens Putin. What kind of strongman is he who can't, make the Russians feel secure? But thousands of Russians have died in terrorist attacks going back 25 years under Putin. And the first ones were probably killed by Putin himself in those sort of apartment bombings in outside of Moscow in 1999. So I actually don't think this necessarily weakens him. It'll give him another reason to crack down. And by cracking down, it gives him sort of another reason to kind of much more firmly hold on to power.
Catherine, last word to you on sort of how you interpret this. I think Matt reminds us both of the history, including the allegations. I'm not sure they've ever been truly proven that
far enough, I would say that you.
But the widely held view. Can we say it that way? that Putin may have conducted terrorist attacks in order to strengthen his hold on power, and the whole of the FSB, of course, is his main source of power early in his presidency, is perhaps this one more sign that he's going to use this to strengthen his hold in the ways that all of you are suggesting, and maybe that's one reason why you blame Ukraine because it gives you that.
I'm sure he will attempt to do that. That is what he does. I mean, I also thought immediately of the apartment bombings when this attack happened, but quickly could see that it really didn't fit that mold, and it doesn't, automatically benefit him. I think the way that the apartment bombings were able to. I think he needs to pivot quite strongly and make, put himself up against this threat, but also align it again with this crucial year for him in Ukraine. So, who knows who believes what in Russia anymore? But as long as he can align it with that and not look like he has failed or taken his eye off the ball, it's so absurd in the sense that, as you mentioned, the Jehovah's Witness and the LGBT, extremists, it's like everything has to be about the West. And in fact, you could hardly come up with a threat less Western than that of ISIS-K. It will be very, very interesting to see that if they try this again and if Russia is the target again. I mean, I think we're going to talk more broadly about terrorist threats to the world in general. But if ISIS see an opportunity to keep going after Russia, I think it will be interesting to see if the Russian people continue to buy this narrative that it's all about Ukraine.
Yeah, but
if they don't, then so what? Perhaps, because what are they going to do about it?
Yeah, can I sort of just chime in? Not only is Russia not a normal country, Putin is not a normal leader. And the only way to read him is cynically, okay? How does whatever is put before him, how can he use it to protect himself from being toppled and from entrenching this regime in power even further? So I think the most likely scenario out of this is going to be, they're going to see more domestic repression, and he's got, he spends billions of dollars on his propaganda machines, and they'll spin it in ways that most of the Russian population will buy. And this is not a population that has shown, with some exceptions, moments of courage in standing up to him or even kind of trying to hold him accountable for anything that happens in Russia, especially not in the last 10 years.
Not a sobering prospect, let's put it that way. Not a very positive one, but probably a realistic one, which is how the world turns. Philip, talking about the world turns, and Catherine already hinted at this. The one thing this attack has clearly done is reminded people that there are still terrorists out there, and they're willing to use spectacular attacks, and this certainly was one of them, in order to get attention. And as Catherine said, the world's attention had shifted away How do you think this is being read in the sort of the security quarters of power in Washington and London and Brussels about how do we sort of re-engage in a very serious way? Or are they saying, no, actually, we're pretty good. After all, the CIA did track ISIS-K and was able to warn people of the attack, as they, by the way, had done with regard to the Iranian attack. And had warned Iran that it was coming as well. So how do you think people are reading it, and how should we read it?
Well, I think I'm not sure so much in Washington, but I know in Europe, people really are re-engaging with the idea of a more general threat of a resurgence from terrorism. As you said, this pendulum had swung. After 9/11, we only worried about terrorism. In the last 5-6 years, we've moved back to state versus state conflict. And certainly, I was talking to some earlier this week, people in the UK on the security side of things are saying, no, the pendulum's got to shift back again now because we've got to focus. And as it was explained to me, that what's been happening in the Middle East, since October the 7th is bad on 3 levels. It's bad on the level that certainly the nature of the war in Gaza now has, as one person put it to me, has empowered all the bad guys in the Middle East. The people who have done well out of this are the groups like Hezbollah, as well as the Iranians, the Houthis in Yemen, that basically the people on the wrong side, because of the nature of the Israeli military campaign and the deaths of so many Palestinians, have won, as it were, in terms of a sort of in a diplomatic sense, and the idea of a Israeli-Arab rapprochement against perhaps Iran as a counterweight to Iran, that's all gone. On a second level, it's empowered the Islamists in the Middle East, and ISIS-K was already on a resurgent trajectory before the Hamas killings of October the 7th. As we've heard, it was growing in Afghanistan. It's not nurtured in any respect by the Taliban, because the Taliban are fierce enemies of ISIS-K, but they haven't been able to contain them. Around the Afghan-Pakistan border, they flourished. So they were researching anyway. What's happened now is that the war in Gaza is radicalizing even more people in the region. So they get more recruits from the Middle East as well as from Central and Eastern Europe. And then there's the domestic threat, and that's on two levels as well. ISIS-K has already been planning, the intelligence services know, attacks in Europe, particularly in Germany, and the German authorities think they foiled at least 2 or 3 potential attacks. They will be looking for a spectacular in Europe to follow that in Moscow. And the fear, of course, is that the radicalization of domestic Muslim populations, which again had sort of seemed to go away, but hadn't really. And if you look at, the tensions in France are still going on about Muslim dress, tensions in other countries, the rise of the sort of far Islamophobe right. So there is a real fear, I think, among European security agencies, intelligence services, that you have this combination of groups like ISIS-K coming in from the outside and, homegrown domestic, if you like, Islamists beginning to be even more radicalized and turn to violence home. So they see it as a really very serious threat.
Very interesting, and not surprising. And Catherine, I'd note, I think that Emmanuel Macron has, if there's one place going to take place in that it might be a locus for a spectacular fight, of course, is the Olympics. In Paris.
I was just going to mention that. I think Macron himself has actually warned, and again, not much attention was paid to this, but he's warned recently that a number of ISIS-K plots had supposedly been disrupted in France. And of course, we've got, there's been another resurgence of tension in France over the policy of laïcité and how it's carried out in schools, where pupils are not permitted to wear religious insignia, which includes headscarves, obviously kippas, crucifixes, etc. But headscarves seem to be the flashpoint, and we've just seen a head teacher quit over death threats concerning allegations that he struck a pupil who refused to remove her headscarf. So that is, and the fact that the French state is about to prosecute that teenage student is very interesting. It reminds me of the fact that they went so hard after those students who were also involved in pointing out the teacher Samuel Paty, who was killed by an Islamist. Beheaded, in fact, in a horrific attack, is that France has, is incredibly defensive of this policy of laïcité and is going to brook no challenge to it. The fact that they have teachers on the front line of policing this, it's a very tense situation. And so, yes, I think that if I were going to say that there was one thing to happen this year that is a greater target than anything else, it's the Summer Olympics in Paris.
Matt, in the U.S., I was in Washington the last couple of days, and I don't recall anybody saying anything about the attacks, or let alone about terrorism coming back. But I may have been talking to the wrong people.
There's a big road out.
What's that?
No, I'm saying that we care about, can only focus on so many things at the same time. And
exactly.
Election, and then you got the Ukraine war and Gaza. So
and Gaza, which is, and I did talk about a lot of those things, of course. But it seems to me, what's your sense of how Washington is looking at that? And frankly, terrorism and the election have a relationship, because part of the Trump critique of Biden is weak and chaos in his wake. And you are seeing people starting to say, see, this is what happens when you withdraw from Afghanistan, and we told you so. Do you see that coming, or how do you think this debate is going to evolve? And is anybody going to take the threat seriously?
I mean, I think it's far-fetched to think that, Western leader is going to take the blame for the incompetence of the FSB and sort of in sort of Moscow, that's sort of better at cracking down on lesbian and gay groups than it is on ISIS potentially. Look, I think there maybe is an argument that Biden now could be thinking that he's got the same test that Obama had and that George Bush had, and by the way, that Trump had, that you cannot allow another domestic attack in the U.S. And by the way, we have not had another, knock on wood, another 9/11 or anything, it's been no terrorist attacks really that have succeeded in the U.S. But that was the litmus test for Obama, certainly following Bush, and might be for Biden. But again, I just don't think what happens in Moscow really resonates here, or even Europe, where you've had a lot of terrorism since 9/11 and pre 9/11, by the way, because you obviously have a much larger domestic population of Muslims, who, some of whom, or a very small number of whom, pose a threat. I do think there's another way that there's a very different dynamic going on here than let's go back to the 9/11 era and post 9/11 era. And two things. The Taliban in Afghanistan is actually fighting this group because they are committing a lot of sort of atrocities in Afghanistan itself. I think the same week there was a bombing in Kandahar that killed, a couple dozen people. And they are a threat to the Taliban regime. So the Taliban is not giving them safe haven willingly. And we didn't do a much better job ourselves in Afghanistan of pushing out ISIS, and Al-Qaeda eventually did. The second thing is that the mainstream or the existing Arab regimes in the region are, if you could say that there was some sympathy and outright support for Al-Qaeda pre 9/11 and even post 9/11 in the Gulf, they're terrified of these guys now. They're terrified of Hamas, which is basically ISIS in the Palestinian territories. And there's nothing more the Saudi royal family or the Gulf Emiratis want is to, one, have the Gaza war end, two, have Hamas destroyed, and three, get back to normalization with Israel, because that is what makes them feel more secure. What happened in Gaza, what happened in Moscow, the Saudis and the people in Dubai and other places, think could happen to them because these people are going after them as much as they would be any Western target. And that's a big change since 20 years ago.
Yeah, no, that is certainly Philip.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I'd put a big but in, because in Iraq and in Syria, you have large areas of not quite ungoverned, but spaces which the central government doesn't really have that much control, and where there are still these pockets. There are still, that's why there are still American and indeed British special forces in these places, still fighting these Islamist terrorists, as it were. So I think there is still, if you take, and the Taliban, and as I said at the beginning, they're against, they haven't been very effective. What they really need is Western help to fight ISIS-K, but that is obviously not so easy, since we don't even recognize them. But I think there's enough space in Syria and Iraq and in Afghanistan for these Islamist groups to thrive again. I think what's happening in Gaza is giving a whole new sort of generation of young, a lot of them unemployed people in these countries, a reason to join the Islamist sort of the jihad, as it were. So I would, I think it's clear that, all intelligence services in the West are a lot better at this now, and they have a much sort of tighter rein. But I still think that, and again, as Catherine said, the Olympics, a complete sort of nightmare. I remember when the Olympics were held in London, the fears then. So I wouldn't be that sort of confident that we don't see, at least in Europe, a significant resurgence in the next year or two or three of this sort of Islamic jihadi terrorism.
But I think there's one thing. I think we're understating the success that we've had against ISIS since 2015. And remember, the Bataclan attacks in Paris were in 2015. You had the bombings in sort of Brussels. You've had a lot of incidents sort of in continental Europe that were much more recent than 9/11. And they have, they've rooted out, not entirely, but largely, ISIS does not control major cities. Yes, there are sort of no go zones in Syria and in Iraq. That's why you have the special forces there. But that operation under the Trump presidency, one might remember, has been successful. And I do think so. Domestically, we are better at this than we were then. And I don't sense,
that's what the Russian
to Europeans complacency, on this, and never have, And the last thing I think it's important to say that Gaza is not mobilizing, some kind of lumpen sort of poor Arabs in the street. That has never been the terrorists, the sort of where terrorists are sort of recruited. They're recruited much more so effectively in suburban Paris or even in parts of London, or from the Arab elites who sort of tend to sort of run these groups. And yeah, I guess there's in theory there's more things that are agitating than now with Gaza, but I see frankly more agitation among kind of liberal, fairly well-off American college students on this, and I don't think they're about to join the sort of terrorist movement.
I think, please, Catherine,
just in terms of ungoverned spaces and where these threats may come from, we like to think about, we defeated ISIS in Syria, but actually there's lots of other places we're not even trying to. Obviously in Afghanistan and the border with Pakistan, Nangarhar province, but some of those people we also believe have gone to Turkey. And we're not sure of Turkey's capability of taking them on, or whether they just want to use Turkey as a base and come elsewhere. And of course, the other area is the Sahel, which has only got worse worse over the last year, with a sort of cascading series of coups, and the disruption in formerly peaceful places, reasonably peaceful places like Senegal. So there's an awful lot of space there. There are large bits of West Africa now that are in jihadist hands, and we have kind of retreated from them as the West. I mean, France is more or less chased out of that part of Africa.
Well, and the U.S. just got chased out of Niger, where they had a drone base with 1,000 troops helping in the counterterrorism fight. I think both things can and probably are true. Which is, on the one hand, we have kind of ignored the threat, and to some extent, and it is growing, and a whole bunch of reasons why. But we are also much better at countering that threat than we were in the past, both from an intelligence and, frankly, from a special forces and disruption capability, and so that and that's a good thing. When it goes wrong is when you miss the boat, as the Russians seem to have missed. And when it goes right is when they dismantle various plots, as the Germans and the French and others, and the Belgians, by the way, just did too, dismantling, and have intelligence services who keep on warning and seem to have penetrated these organizations better than certainly we did prior to 9/11. So it gives you a little bit of hope that vigilance may continue to pay off, but you need to remain vigilant. I think that's clearly the message, and that was lost on the FSB, which has become a cult. What did you call it? The Praetorian Guard, Catherine, for Putin, a cultish Praetorian Guard, no less, in some ways. Last but certainly not least, and it's all linked in some ways. I mean, the war in Gaza, no doubt, is a radicalizing influence. It may not lead directly to new terrorists, but it doesn't help in terms of the narrative that terrorist groupings have with regard to fighting Israel and fighting the West, and for partly domestic reasons in the United States and in Israel, Matt, but partly because there are fundamental differences that have been there since October 7. We seem to be moving to a point where Bibi and Biden are, they are no longer at strictly civil terms, and the political break seems to be pretty big, though not complete and certainly not total.
Well, it's. I think Bibi has accomplished something which no one thought possible, that he's alienated probably the most pro-Israeli Democrat left in this country, which is Joe Biden. It's the isolate. Biden, I think by instinct after October 7th and by sort of true feeling, he gave this very moving speech that a lot of American Jews and a lot of Israelis appreciated, a lot of Americans appreciated, saying this is horrible, we stand in solidarity. And I think it is partly because the way that Israel has carried out the war, but it's also the way that Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, has really kind of carried himself here, that he has been sort of abrasive. He's clearly a very damaged politician. And we've come to a point where you have the U.S., I think for the first time that I can remember, did not step in to veto a resolution in the UN Security Council this week that called on Israel to sort of stop the fighting in Gaza. What Bibi did in response was to call back a delegation led by Ron Dermer, who's one of his sort of most important advisors. As significantly, Ron Dermer was the Israeli ambassador in Washington during the Trump days and had a famously close relationship with Trump. And so we're in this kind of funny waiting game, I think, where I think in America, you're sort of waiting for Bibi to go away. You had Chuck Schumer calling for him to step down. And I think very much Biden is also really wants the Gaza thing to stop. It is dragging him down politically. So leaving aside sort of strategic or moral reasons, just the kind of the clear political calculus is that Biden cannot win this election if he cannot win Michigan, if he wins Michigan, he's probably going to win the election. The biggest Arab American community is in Michigan. And that's sort of, even, if it means that 20,000 fewer people turn out to vote, that could be the difference maker. So they're waiting Bibi out. Bibi, like Putin, I think is trying to probably wait Biden out, that he thinks that, if Trump comes in, you're going to have a much friendlier president in the White House and a party that's not going to be as hard on him. And, in that he's probably supported by a majority of Israelis who have, it is the country where I think Trump probably has the highest approval ratings of any country in the world, maybe besides Russia, would be Israel. So, I think I leave aside whether it's the right thing to do on Rafah or not, leave aside, the sort of the ethics of all this, but, seen from Washington, this is a purely political play now, both for the Netanyahu, for him and for Washington, for the administration here. And they're seeing this very much through the campaign prism right now.
And in some ways, this political shadow boxing that both of them are doing is becoming deeply personal between the two as well. It seems.
But he has he sort of hated Obama. He was so disrespectful to Obama, and Obama really returned the favor. I think there's a sort of an anecdote where Netanyahu is sort of talking to him, and Obama turns to an aide and says, like, "Wait a minute. Remind me who's the leader of the free world here, and Bibi's abrasive with everyone, but especially Democratic presidents.
Right, he did the same to Bill Clinton in some ways.
Exactly. I
think Biden likes to tell the story that he sent a picture, which Bibi has in his office, of the two of them, in which he wrote on the picture, Bibi. Yeah, I don't agree with anything that you believe in, but I love you, brother. Something like that. So that relationship has been around for a long time. Catherine, is it just politics, or are we actually also seeing? Not that Matt implied that it wasn't, but there's some real fundamental differences here on the war and how to conduct it.
There are fundamental differences, absolutely. But I do agree with Matt that for both sides, for the Israeli side and for the US side, this is fundamentally about the domestic politics. The irony is, of course, that Netanyahu is horribly unpopular in Israel. Has been for some time, but even after October 7th, the pressure he's come under from hostage families, and the personal distaste so many Israelis have felt for him, versus how they felt towards Biden when he came over and gave that very heartfelt speech that Bibi himself didn't seem to be able to deliver to his own people at the time. But the dislike of domestic dislike of Bibi, of course, can't be separated from the fact that most Israelis are behind the all-out assault on Hamas and want it finished. I agree again with Matt that everyone's waiting each other out. Bibi, of course, is existential for him. He could go to jail if this war were to end and for politics as usual to take over in Israel. He's facing these corruption charges, all of which have sort of been put on the back burner. But apart from that, there are absolutely fundamental differences. And I think that Joe Biden's repugnance for the manner in which Israel is carrying out its campaign is real. It's not simply about the votes he gets in Michigan. And I think that's quite visceral, and it's shared around the world. There's plenty of countries that feel that way. But I think the lack of a veto, the abstention in the UN Security Council was pretty soft compared to what it could have been. That was a symbolic resolution. Now, had that been a binding resolution with some consequence behind it, that would have been a whole new territory for the relationship between the US and Israel. But I think, again, it's important to remember that the US presidents have in the past managed to pressure Israel into doing things like withdrawing from the Sinai, but only usually when US interests themselves were directly imperiled, rather than the fate of one presidential candidate.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And Philip, last point to you, there was a leaked memo, State Department memo, to National Public Radio a week ago, in which the author was signed by Tony Blinken, but in which the point was made that what is really going on is a generational anti-Israel emergence throughout the world because of what is happening here, and that in some real form, Israel is losing in the world, and that is having the impact not only on the United States but on everybody else and its ability to get anything done at a time when Israel actually had reemerged because of the Abraham Accords and other accords as a diplomatic player in the world, and that is possibly the worst setback for Israel's security that imaginable. You agree? You see it the same way?
Well, I think it's a judgment that's certainly shared in, say, the British Foreign Office. And if you look at some of the public statements of David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, you catch some of what I would say is real anger and frustration at the British government's view. It's interesting that both France and the UK supported the resolution, didn't just abstain. And I think you've got two things going on in European nations. They look at this, and even you get this even in Germany. On the one hand, they think this is bad, really bad for Israel, as that memo said, that this is basically separating Israel from its allies in the West in a really, really serious way. And of course, they also think it's bad for them. I mean, they think, for example, it's stirring the Islamist threat, but it's also stirring anti-Semitism. You see it in there's been a spate of, or a sharp rise in the number of anti-Semitic attacks in Britain and in other European countries. So I've spoken privately to some senior conservative politicians, and I have never, ever heard these people talk about Israel, or not Israel, about the regime, as some of them call it, of Mr. Netanyahu in the manner that they are now. And I talked to one minister who said it's perfectly clear the war is being conducted like this to keep Netanyahu in power, to make sure the war continues so he can hold on. This isn't about Israeli security. This is about Netanyahu holding on to power. Now, when you get senior politicians saying that about, and Britain's a good ally to Israel, you step back and think this is really quite a serious split.
I just maybe sort of sound one note there, which is that you don't pick up that split when you talk to the Israelis, including Israelis who want Netanyahu gone. But I think in this coalition government, there is a consensus that I think probably reflects a majority view in Israel itself, that what happened on October 7th was the worst thing that's happened to Jews since the Holocaust. We live in the Middle East. If you don't show that there is a price to pay for something like this, we will not survive in this region far longer. And therefore, we are going to conduct the war the way we're conducting it, because that has the support of the Israeli people. So I think that's the one. I very much take the point that outside of Israel, this is costing them dearly. And Netanyahu is such a toxic figure that he is sort of, I think, isolating Israel more than if you had someone else doing that. But I don't think someone else would conduct the war all that differently than it is being conducted now. And it does not excuse the lack of access to humanitarian aid. It doesn't excuse anything. I'm just sort of noting that I don't think they would sort of conduct it differently if Bibi was not in power.
You're getting people like Ehud Olmert saying very different things in Israel. So it's not just outside Israel. You are getting, someone like Olmert saying it is
Omar, Barak as well, but I think Matt's point.
He's not in the government, and he's a very
right.
Yeah, he's
I think Matt's point is different, which is that the way, at least, it points out a different issue. The way the war is being seen from the outside, from Israel's closest friends, is fundamentally different than the way it is being seen by a large majority of Israelis. And that's a very dangerous a situation. It's dangerous for Israel's friends in outside of Israel, and I think Biden's political peril is underscored by that. It's dangerous for Israel's relationship with the rest of the world. And I think that is, in some ways, what is encapsulated by these differences. And I think if we care, and many of us and all of us do, for security in the region, let's hope that we can get over past this and find a way out that offers more prospect for peace for all peoples in the region than we have currently today. So we've gone a little longer, not because we like to talk, but because there's so much important things to say that we like to talk about. And I want to thank Catherine Philp of the London Times, Philip Stevens of the Financial Times, Matt Kaminski of Politico for a really excellent conversation across a series of very important issues. And I want to thank you all for tuning in. We will be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a wonderful weekend.